The water pressure outside is crushing enough to snap a steel beam like a twig. It is 1981 deep beneath the icy, sunless surface of the Barents Sea. Inside the control room of a Soviet Project 705 Lyra submarine known to NATO as the Alfa-class, the air is thick with the smell of ozone, recycled oxygen, and unfiltered cigarettes. The captain, a man chosen for his aggression and unwavering loyalty to the party, stands with his arms crossed, watching the depth gauge with a look of supreme confidence. He is commanding the fastest, deepest diving, and most expensive submarine ever built by human hands. His hull is not made of conventional steel. It is forged from pure titanium, a metal so difficult to work with that the CIA believed it was impossible to mass-produce. His reactor is not cooled by water, but by a terrifyingly volatile mixture of liquid lead bismuth. He is sitting inside a nuclear-powered rocket. He orders full speed. The reactor screams as the liquid metal coolant surges through the core. The titanium hull groans under the immense torque. The submarine surges forward, accelerating like a sports car, a feat that should be impossible for a vessel weighing thousands of tons. The speedometer climbs past 30 knots, then 35, then 40. At 40 knots underwater, the Alpha is faster than most American torpedoes. It is a technological marvel, a predator designed to outrun its own hunters. The captain smiles. He feels invincible. He believes the Americans, with their steel-hulled boats that struggle to reach 30 knots, are obsolete relics of a bygone era. He imagines them as lumbering whales helpless against the speed and agility of his titanium shark. But he has made a fatal miscalculation. In his obsession with speed, he has forgotten the first and most sacred rule of the underwater jungle. The predator does not scream. 2 miles behind him, sitting in the pitch-black void of the abyss, another vessel is watching. It is the USS Los Angeles. Inside its darkened sonar room, bathed in the red glow of tactical displays, a young American petty officer is wearing headphones, his eyes closed in deep concentration. He doesn't see the Alpha. He hears it. At 40 knots, the Soviet submarine is so loud it sounds like a freight train derailing underwater. Its propellers are cavitating, creating millions of vacuum bubbles that collapse with the force of gunshots. Its reactor pumps are whining with a distinct mechanical frequency. The American captain doesn't need to chase. He doesn't need to burn his reactor to the red line. He simply steers his boat into the acoustic shadow, following the noise like a man following a marching band. He matches the Soviets' course, keeping a polite, lethal distance. He has been following the Alpha for 3 days. The Soviet captain thinks he is the hunter. He has no idea that he is actually the bait. He has no idea that a firing solution for a Mark 48 torpedo has been locked onto his engine room for 72 hours. The laughter in the Soviet Admiralty about slow American boats is about to be silenced by the terrifying reality of acoustic warfare. Speed is life, they said. But in the deep, silence is victory. To understand this high-stakes underwater chess game, we must peel back the layers of secrecy that shrouded the Cold War's most dangerous front. While the world watched the tanks in Germany and the nuclear missiles in Cuba, the real war was happening in the dark, crushing depths of the Atlantic, where no journalist could see and no camera could record. The Soviet Union, a land power by nature, had always struggled to challenge the United States at sea. They knew they could not match the U.S. Navy ship for ship. They couldn't build carriers as big or crews as experienced, so they decided to cheat physics. They poured billions of rubles into a revolutionary idea, the titanium submarine. Steel, the material used by every other navy on Earth, is heavy and magnetic. Titanium is light, strong, and non-magnetic. It allows a submarine to dive deeper down to 2,000 feet or more, where standard American torpedoes would be crushed by the water pressure. It makes the boat faster and immune to magnetic mines, but titanium is a nightmare to work with. It must be welded in an argon gas atmosphere by workers wearing spacesuits in clean rooms that rival a hospital operating theater. It is astronomically expensive. The Alfa-class submarines were so costly that they were nicknamed the Golden Fish by the Soviet sailors who joked that it would have been cheaper to build them out of solid gold. But the Kremlin didn't care about the cost. They cared about the interception. Their doctrine was purely defensive. They believed that in the opening minutes of World War III, American aircraft carriers would approach the Soviet coast to launch nuclear strikes. The Alpha was designed as an underwater interceptor, a maritime version of a MiG-25. It would sit in port, wait for the alarm, and then sprint out to sea at 40 knots to kill the carriers before they could launch their planes. It was a brute force solution. It was a hot rod. And like most hot rods, it was loud, temperamental, and unsubtle. The Soviet designers believed that speed was the ultimate defense. If they fire a torpedo, the logic went, we will simply outrun it. We will dive deeper than it can go. Who cares if we are loud? We will be gone before they can shoot. This arrogance blinded them to the revolution happening on the other side of the ocean. The U.S. Navy looked at the problem of submarine warfare through a completely different lens. They didn't see it as a race. They saw it as a hunt. They knew they couldn't build titanium hulls. The cost was prohibitive for a democratic nation answerable to taxpayers. They knew they couldn't match the Alpha's raw speed. So they decided to own the electromagnetic spectrum. They built the Los Angeles class. On paper, the 688 looked inferior. It was slower, struggling to hit 32 knots. It couldn't dive as deep, limited to around 1,000 feet. It was made of conventional steel. But inside it was a spaceship. The Americans invested heavily in two things the Soviets neglected: sonar and soundproofing. They mounted a massive spherical sonar array in the nose of the boat, occupying the entire bow, so sensitive it could hear a shrimp snapping its claws a mile away. They towed long tails of hydrophones miles behind the boat to listen to the blind spots in their own wake. And they made the boat itself a ghost. Every pump, every fan, every motor inside a Los Angeles-class sub was mounted on rubber rafts to isolate vibration from the hull. The propellers were designed with classified computer algorithms to slice through the water without creating cavitation bubbles. The crew wore sneakers. They spoke in whispers. Rig for ultra-quiet became a religious ritual. The philosophy was simple: first to see, first to shoot. If the American sub could hear the Soviet sub at 50 miles, but the Soviet sub could only hear the American at 5 miles, the speed difference didn't matter. The American would fire a wire-guided torpedo from 10 miles away. The Soviet captain would be dead before he even knew he was in a fight. But the Soviets were confident. They believed their own propaganda. They believed their noise levels were acceptable. Then came the Walker spy ring. In one of the most damaging intelligence failures in U.S. history, John Walker, a U.S. Navy warrant officer, sold the Soviets the keys to the kingdom. He told them quite bluntly, "We can hear you. We can hear everything." He revealed that the U.S. Navy's SOSUS network, a chain of secret listening devices on the ocean floor, was tracking Soviet submarines from the moment they left port. He told them that their propellers were making a specific blade rate noise that identified each individual boat like a fingerprint. The Soviet admirals were stunned. They realized their invisible fleet was actually a brass band marching through a library. This revelation sparked a panic in the Kremlin. But instead of rethinking their doctrine, they doubled down on the Alpha. They believed that even if the Americans could hear them, the Alpha's performance was so superior that it didn't matter. This set the stage for the confrontations of the 1980s. The Barents Sea became a gladiatorial arena. The American captains commanding their Los Angeles-class boats were given aggressive orders: go north, find them, trail them, gather data. They called it checking the plumbing. The stories from these missions are the stuff of legend. One American commander recounted trailing a Soviet Victor-class submarine for weeks. He got so close that he could hear the Soviet crew flushing the toilets. He could hear them dropping wrenches in the engine room. He took photos of the Soviet submarine's propeller through his periscope while submerged, a feat of seamanship that is akin to sneaking up behind a person and stealing their wallet without them noticing. But tracking an Alpha was different. An Alpha was erratic. Because of its liquid metal reactor, the Alpha couldn't just turn its engine off. If the liquid lead bismuth cooled down, it would solidify into a solid block of metal, turning the submarine into a radioactive tomb. The reactor had to be kept hot, and the pumps had to be kept running at all times. This meant the Alpha was always making noise. An encounter in 1983 illustrates the disparity perfectly. A USS Los Angeles-class boat picked up a contact in the North Atlantic. It was moving fast, erratic. It was an Alpha. The American captain ordered ultra-quiet. The crew stopped moving. The ventilation was turned off. The boat drifted, becoming a hole in the ocean. The Alpha zoomed past its sonar, pinging actively. Active sonar is like a flashlight in the dark. It helps you see, but it tells everyone exactly where you are. The Soviet captain was using it because his passive sensors were deafened by his own speed. He was shouting into the dark, trying to find an enemy. He missed the American boat by less than 1,000 yards. As the Alpha roared away, the American captain gently maneuvered into its baffles, the blind spot directly behind the propeller. He stayed there for hours. He recorded the Alpha's acoustic signature. He simulated firing a torpedo. He simulated a hit. Then, just to prove a point, he utilized the underwater telephone. He sent a ping of his own. One single active ping directed right at the Alpha's hull. It was the underwater equivalent of tapping someone on the shoulder. The Alpha panicked. It initiated a crazy Ivan. This was a desperate Soviet maneuver. The submarine would suddenly turn 180 degrees and sprint back the way it came, trying to clear its baffles and ram anything following it. It was a suicidal move. If the American boat hadn't been alert, there would have been a collision. But the American captain, anticipating the move, simply drifted down deeper into the abyss. The Alpha roared overhead, its sonar screaming, chasing a ghost. The Soviet captain reported back to base that he had been harassed by an unknown contact. He didn't realize he had been toyed with. The realization that their invisible submarines were actually broadcasting their position to the entire NATO alliance forced the Soviet High Command into a humiliating strategic retreat. The open Atlantic, once considered a hunting ground, had become a kill zone. The Soviet admirals looked at their maps and made a desperate decision. If they could not hide in the silence of the deep ocean, they would hide in the noise of the shallow ice. They withdrew their ballistic missile submarines to the bastions, the frozen hostile waters of the Barents Sea and the Sea of Okhotsk, protected by a permanent roof of polar ice. They believed that the chaotic grinding sounds of the shifting ice pack would mask the noise of their propellers, and that the jagged, inverted mountain ranges of ice hanging down from the surface would prevent the American hunters from following them. To dominate this new battlefield, they built a machine that was the antithesis of the sleek, fast Alpha. They built a monster. They called it Project 941 Akula, but the world knows it by the terrifying name NATO gave it, the Typhoon. The Typhoon was not just a submarine. It was an underwater cathedral. It remains the largest submarine ever built, a Leviathan displacing 48,000 tons, twice as heavy as the American Ohio-class, and longer than a football field. Inside its massive double hull, it carried 20 intercontinental ballistic missiles, each capable of destroying a major American city. It even had a swimming pool and a sauna for the crew. The Soviet logic was simple. The Typhoon didn't need to be fast. It didn't need to go to America. It just needed to sit silently under the Arctic ice protected by the entire Soviet Northern Fleet and wait for the order to end the world. It was the ultimate expression of the bastion strategy. The Soviet generals laughed again, confident that no American captain would be crazy enough to drive a nuclear reactor into the narrow, freezing labyrinth beneath the polar ice cap, where sonar is unreliable and surfacing is often impossible. But they had underestimated the cold professionalism of the United States submarine force. The Americans didn't see the ice as a wall. They saw it as a new ceiling. They modified the Los Angeles-class boats, hardening their sail structures with reinforced steel so they could smash through feet of solid ice to launch missiles or communicate. They developed high-frequency sonar specifically designed to map the ice keels, the deadly spikes of frozen water that hung down like stalactites, threatening to rip the top off a submarine. And then they went hunting. The game of cat and mouse shifted from a high-speed chase in the open ocean to a knife fight in a dark closet. Under the ice, the background noise was deafening, the shrieking and groaning of millions of tons of ice grinding together. This environment leveled the playing field. The American sonar advantage was reduced, but their acoustic discipline became even more critical. The encounters that took place under the roof of the world were among the most terrifying and classified of the Cold War. American captains would pilot their 6,900-ton vessels into the bastions, creeping along at 3 knots sometimes, with only a few feet of clearance between the ocean floor below and the ice above. They were operating in the enemy's backyard, completely cut off from the outside world. If they sank, there would be no rescue. If they were attacked, no one would ever know. Yet they stayed. They found the Typhoons. They trailed them. There are stories whispered in the mess halls of submarine base New London of American boats getting so close to the Soviet giants that they could visually inspect their hulls using low-light TV cameras. The bastion was not a sanctuary. It was a trap. The Soviet captains, believing they were safe in their frozen fortress, would often conduct routine patrols, unaware that a Los Angeles-class hunter was silently drifting in their baffles, the blind spot directly behind their screws, recording every turn, every depth change, and every mechanical groan. The proximity of these encounters led to moments of heart-stopping terror. In the murky, noisy waters, sonar was not always perfect. Sometimes the hunter and the hunted bumped into each other. These underwater collisions were officially denied by both sides for decades, but the scars on the hulls told a different story. In one infamous incident, the USS Tautog, an older Sturgeon-class attack sub paving the way for the Los Angeles fleet, collided violently with a Soviet Echo II-class submarine. The American boat rolled on its side, the sound of tearing metal screaming through the hull. The crew thought they were dead. But the American steel held. The Soviet boat was not so lucky. It is believed to have suffered catastrophic damage. These collisions were not accidents of navigation. They were the result of an aggressive, relentless American doctrine that demanded continuous contact. The U.S. Navy wanted the Soviet captains to know with absolute certainty that they were never alone. They wanted to instill a psychological paranoia that would paralyze the Soviet fleet, and it worked. The psychological toll on the Soviet submarine crews was immense. Imagine being the captain of a Typhoon. You are in command of the most powerful weapon system on Earth. You are surrounded by friendly destroyers and aircraft on the surface. You are under the ice. You should be safe. But every time you put on your sonar headphones, you hear ghosts. You hear a transient noise that sounds like a hatch closing or a dropped wrench. But when you turn your ship to investigate, there is nothing there. You start to doubt your own equipment. You start to doubt your crew. You start to realize that the silence of the ocean is actually teeming with invisible enemies. The Soviet doctrine of mass, building the biggest submarines and the most missiles, was being eroded by the American doctrine of presence. The U.S. Navy didn't need to sink the Typhoons to win. They just needed to make the Soviet leadership afraid to use them. As the 1980s wore on, the technological noose tightened. The U.S. introduced the improved Los Angeles-class, the 608 These boats were even quieter. They moved the diving planes from the sail to the hull, reducing noise. They covered the hull in advanced anechoic tiles, rubber coatings that absorbed active sonar pings, making the submarine invisible to the Soviet flashlights. The gap was widening. The Soviets were still struggling to mass-produce quiet propellers, while the Americans were already moving on to the next generation of noise reduction. The Soviet spies tried desperately to steal the secrets. The Toshiba Kongsberg scandal, where Japanese and Norwegian companies illegally sold advanced milling machinery to the USSR, allowed the Soviets to finally build quieter propellers for their Akula-class boats. The Akula was a shock to the West. It was the first Soviet submarine that was truly difficult to hear. But it was too little too late. The economic reality of the arms race was crushing the Soviet Union. A Typhoon-class submarine was a marvel, but it cost as much as a small country's GDP to build and maintain. The intricate titanium hulls of the Alpha and Sierra classes were draining the treasury. The Americans, with their standardized, mass-produced steel Los Angeles-class boats, were winning the war of attrition. The U.S. could afford to keep a constant rotation of submarines in the Barents Sea. The Soviets could barely afford the fuel to send their Typhoons out on patrol once a year. The wolf packs of the Atlantic were rusting at the pier. The pride of the Soviet Navy was becoming a fleet of museum pieces before the war even ended. Then came the ultimate humiliation. As the Soviet Union began to fracture in 1991, the discipline of the Northern Fleet collapsed. The terrifying Typhoons designed to end civilization ended up as bargaining chips in a chaotic geopolitical divorce. Crews went unpaid. Reactors were left unmaintained. The bastions were abandoned not because of enemy fire, but because there was no money to buy food for the sailors. The American submarines, still patrolling silently offshore, watched the death of a superpower through their periscopes. They watched as the red flags were lowered and the Russian tricolors were raised. They watched as the feared Typhoon fleet was tied up at the docks of Severodvinsk, destined to rot. The Cold War under the sea ended not with a nuclear bang, but with the quiet hum of a cooling pump shutting down for the last time. The U.S. Navy had won the most dangerous game of hide-and-seek in human history. They had proven that in the unforgiving environment of the deep technology matters, but philosophy matters more. The Soviets built submarines to be weapons. The Americans built submarines to be intelligence platforms. The Soviets bet on the strength of their hulls. The Americans bet on the skill of their ears. And when the ice finally melted, it was the silent service that remained the undisputed masters of the deep. The end of the Cold War did not bring peace to the depths. It brought a strange, asymmetric twilight. While the Soviet Union dissolved, the momentum of the American military-industrial complex continued to surge forward, driven by the paranoia that the Red Bear might one day wake up. In the late 1980s, just before the collapse, the U.S. Navy had committed to building the ultimate Predator, a machine designed to hunt down the Typhoons and the Alphas, even if the Soviets managed to make them quiet. This machine was the Seawolf class. If the Los Angeles-class was a hunter, the Seawolf was a serial killer. It was the most expensive, most advanced, and most lethal submarine ever conceived. The Seawolf was born from a specific fear, the fear that the Soviets would finally master the art of silence. Intelligence reports on the new Russian Akula-class suggested that the acoustic gap was closing. The U.S. Navy's response was to shatter the curve completely. The Seawolf was designed with a hull made of HY100 steel, stronger than anything previously used, allowing it to dive to depths that rivaled the titanium Alfas. It was fitted with a pump jet propulsor instead of a propeller, a shrouded fan that churned the water without creating the telltale cavitation bubbles, allowing it to move at 20 knots in total silence. It carried twice as many torpedoes as a Los Angeles-class boat, and it had 8 torpedo tubes instead of 4. It was designed to swim into a bastion take on the entire Soviet Northern Fleet single-handed and win, but the Seawolf arrived too late. The enemy it was built to destroy had committed suicide. When the first Seawolf hit the water in 1997, the Soviet Union was a memory. The Russian Navy was rusting in port. The ultimate predator had no prey. The program was slashed from 29 boats to just 3. They became the white elephants of the deep technological marvels with no war to fight. Yet their existence served as a final crushing statement of American dominance. The U.S. had built a machine that was generations ahead of anything the bankrupt Russian Federation could hope to design. The Seawolf proved that even if Russia tried to come back, the technological mountain they had to climb was now Everest. The tragic reality of the post-Soviet Russian Navy was revealed to the world not in a battle, but in a disaster that broke the heart of a nation. On August 12, 2000, the Russian Navy launched a massive exercise in the Barents Sea. The star of the show was the K-141 Kursk, an Oscar II-class cruise missile submarine. The Oscar II was a terrifying machine designed specifically to kill American aircraft carriers with swarms of shipwreck missiles. It was massive, double-hulled, and considered unsinkable by its crews. But inside the belly of the beast, the rot of the Soviet collapse was festering. The Kursk was carrying a practice torpedo fueled by high-test peroxide, HTP. HTP is a volatile, dangerous chemical that the British and American navies had abandoned in the 1950s because it was too unstable. But the Soviets, obsessed with performance and cheap solutions, had kept using it. At 11:28 a.m., a faulty weld on the torpedo casing failed. The HTP leaked onto the hot engine parts. It triggered a catalytic explosion equal to 100 kilograms of TNT. The blast ripped through the torpedo room, killing the forward crew instantly. But the Kursk did not die immediately. It sank to the bottom wounded. 2 minutes later, the fire from the first explosion detonated the rest of the warheads. A massive seismic event shook the Barents Sea, registering on seismographs as far away as Alaska. The entire bow of the submarine was vaporized. The unsinkable double hull was torn open like a tin can. 23 sailors in the rear compartments survived the initial blast. They huddled in the dark, cold, and rising water, waiting for a rescue that would never come. The Russian Navy, paralyzed by secrecy, pride, and incompetent equipment, failed to open the escape hatch. They refused international help for days, terrified of letting NATO see their secrets. By the time Norwegian divers finally cracked the hatch, the interior was flooded. All 118 hands were lost. The tragedy of the Kursk was the final epitaph for the Soviet philosophy of naval warfare. They had built a massive, powerful, terrifying machine capable of destroying cities and sinking fleets. But they had cut corners on the smallest details, a weld-a-fuel type, a safety seal. They had prioritized the big weapon over the safety of the crew. The Kursk didn't sink because of enemy action. It sank because of the systemic neglect that defined the late Soviet era. It was a metaphor for the empire itself, a titanium shell hiding a crumbling, volatile core. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy watched the tragedy with a mix of horror and professional sympathy. American submarines were operating in the area listening to the explosions. They knew exactly what had happened long before the Kremlin admitted it. The acoustic data from the explosion confirmed that the Russian fleet was dangerous, not because it was effective, but because it was unstable. The silent war had shifted from hunting a predator to monitoring a decaying corpse that might explode at any moment. In the decades that followed, Russia attempted to rebuild. Under Vladimir Putin, money was poured back into the submarine force. They finally launched the Yasin-class Project 885, led by the Severodvinsk. The Yasin is a formidable boat. It is quiet. It carries hypersonic missiles. U.S. admirals have admitted that the Yasin is a peer competitor, capable of evading detection in the Atlantic. The Russian bear has learned from its mistakes. They have abandoned the loud, fast Alpha doctrine in favor of the American doctrine of stealth. But the United States has not stood still. While Russia struggled to build a handful of Yasins over 20 years, the U.S. Navy began churning out the Virginia-class. The Virginia is the spiritual successor to the Los Angeles. It is cheaper than the Seawolf, but smarter. It is designed for the modern world of drone warfare, special operations, and literal combat. It doesn't just listen with a sonar sphere. It listens with a fiber-optic network of sensors that can be deployed miles away from the hull. The philosophical gap remains. The Russian doctrine is still focused on the lone wolf, a single powerful ship sent out to wreak havoc. The American doctrine has evolved into networked warfare. A Virginia-class submarine is not alone. It is a node in a web that includes P-8 Poseidon aircraft, underwater drones, seabed sensors, and satellites. If a Russian submarine moves in the Atlantic today, it isn't just hiding from another submarine. It is hiding from an entire planetary surveillance system. The acoustic daylight has become so bright that there are no shadows left to hide in. As we look back at the underwater arms race of the Cold War, the lesson is stark. The Soviet Union fell into the trap of parametric obsession. They obsessed over the parameters they could measure on a chart: speed, depth, missile count. They built the Alpha to go 40 knots because 40 is bigger than 30. They built the Typhoon to be the biggest because size equals power. They laughed at the American boats for being slower and smaller. But warfare is not top trumps. It is not about who has the biggest number. It is about who completes the kill chain. The Americans realized that a submarine is fundamentally an information-gathering platform that carries weapons. If you have more information than the enemy, if you know where he is and he doesn't know where you are, you win. 30 knots is infinitely faster than 40 knots if the 40-knot ship is swimming blind into an ambush. The legacy of the Los Angeles class is one of quiet professional dominance. These boats never fired a torpedo in anger at a Soviet submarine. They didn't have to. Their victory was achieved by being constantly present, constantly listening, and constantly denying the Soviet Navy the safety of the deep. They turned the ocean from a Soviet sanctuary into a Soviet prison. Today, the rusted hulls of the Alfa-class submarines have been scrapped, their toxic reactors stored in concrete caskets in the Arctic. The Typhoons are being dismantled, their swimming pools empty, their missile tubes silent. But the USS Los Angeles and her sisters are still out there. Some have been retired, but many still patrol, silent guardians of the trade routes. The laughter of the Soviet admirals has been replaced by a grudging respect and perhaps a quiet fear. They learned the hard way that in the unforgiving physics of the ocean, you cannot outrun sound. You cannot bully the laws of acoustics. And you cannot defeat an enemy who has turned silence into a weapon of mass destruction. The story of the Silent War is the story of the tortoise and the hare played out with nuclear reactors. The hare ran fast, made a lot of noise, and exhausted itself to death. The tortoise moved slow, stayed quiet, and owns the finish line. And deep in the Atlantic, in the eternal darkness where the pressure crushes bone and steel, the silence is still American.